the first time I've ever addressed Green Party members, so please be nice to me. No, I'm joking. I'm sure you'll be very pleasant and ask very difficult questions, which is, why I'm here. I want to hear what you have to say. And in particular, I wanted to come to speak to members of the Green Party because I wanted to show as a Conservative that green issues and protecting the environment and getting to net zero should not be, and I don't believe is, a party political football. By all means, we will have debates about how best to achieve that, maybe the speed, maybe the nature of what we have to do. But we all agree that this is of immense importance. And I think it's very important and incumbent upon me as a Conservative, not to try and convert you to conservatism, though that'd be nice, but more to explain how I as a Conservative see the environmental challenges that we face and to hear how you view that differently. Because frankly, as a society, unless we can have enough commonality between our views on this subject, we will not achieve what we want to achieve. So that's why I want to come to speak to you, and I really appreciate the fact you're coming to listen to me. What I thought I'd do is really just talk about give you sort of two broad themes to my talk. The first is national issues and sort of how I see this at a macro national level. And then second is locally and the sort of things that I think we need to do in Hertfordshire, whether it be in St Albans, Harpenden, or not just in Hertfordshire, but in parts of the country like Hertfordshire, which again, I think is something that's very important. So nationally, in fact, earlier on today, I gave a talk to Net Zero Live, which is a collection of hundreds of people globally talking about the road to net zero. And the title of my talk this morning was how to get to net zero while strengthening our economy and improving our lives. And the way how I would like to persuade you that that's how we can achieve net zero, and I think that that's important, by the way, not because of any political reason. Frankly, if we can't show people that getting to net zero is going to be a benefit to them over the medium long term, they may have to change their behavior in the short term. They may have to change how they do things. They may have to drive an electric car rather than a petrol car, or they may have to have a different type of heating system in their house. But fundamentally, unless we can show that this will improve people's lives, I think it'll be very, very difficult to achieve. And I think that improving the economy is also key to that. So how do we do that? In summary, the first thing we need to do is we need to effectively rewire our industrial base. We need to electrify everything that we can electrify, just to have a chance of achieving net zero. And that is everything from transport, which I've already mentioned, to heating, to the industrial processes which make our goods. We need to try and electrify as much as possible. Because if we can do that, and by the way, we need to start that process now. If we can do that, then again, it will help us get to net zero. But this feeds into the second thing that we need to do. And that is, the government needs to put full square support behind not just wind energy, not just experimental hydrogen. I'm sure some of you will know a lot about hydrogen technology, and I'm interested if anybody wants to ask me a question about that. Not just wind, which we're already doing well on, not just hydrogen, but also nuclear. And I'm sure, again, there'll be differing views on this, but it's my position that nuclear should be part of our net zero energy mix. It provides very consistent energy. I won't use the term baseload because I've been told off many times for using the term baseload, but consistent energy that is very predictable for a long period of time. And critically, and this is the bit about improving the economy, it creates jobs, often in parts of the country where we are decarbonising. So there'll be a real social and economic need to provide high quality skilled jobs. And that's what nuclear can do. And in the areas of the country where I've visited, such as in Suffolk with Sizewell, or in Cumbria, where my colleague Trudy Harrison is very close to the nuclear industry, her husband worked in it, she worked in it, the value that gives those communities in very bread and butter ways is very considerable. So I think nuclear needs to be part of the mix, in addition to, of course, onshore and offshore wind power as well, in addition to, and of course, hydrogen needs to be part of that mix. But the third thing that we need to do if we want to get to net zero and improve our lives and improve the state of the economy is we need to alter how we think about the tax burden. Now, look, I'm a conservative. I like low tax. I think low tax is a very important way of driving economic growth and opportunity and freedom. But we do have to tax. And where we tax, we should be taxing the things that are bad for the environment. We should be taxing them more. And through doing that, we will drive behavioral change, and in the shorter term, we'll raise revenue, and we can put that revenue into all the other things that we know need to happen, whether it be renewable energy, whether it be retrofitting homes, whether it be better insulation, whether it be helping people pay for new heating systems, like the Green Homes grant that the Chancellor has come up with and is doing. That's great, but we're going to have to do a lot more of that sort of thing across huge swathes of how individuals, companies, and households behave. So we're going to have to raise money for this. And, you know, sometimes politicians go around and pretend that things are cost-free. I'm afraid getting to net zero is going to cost money. I think the private sector will be able to do the lion's share of the, well, private sector will do the innovation. It will provide a lot of the finance, and there's a lot the government can do around changing the dates at which certain things will happen. So, for example, if we say we move forward the date from which petrol and diesel cars, we won't allow them to be sold, then that will drive more investment faster into electric cars, which will be the private sector doing things. But the public sector has a big role too. The public sector needs to set the rules of the game, and it needs to help provide its finance as well in areas where the private sector won't see a return. And so we have to be honest about that. The Green Home Grant is an example of the sort of thing that we need to be doing. So that is how I see things. In local terms, what does this mean? Again, I'm not a Puritan or a moralist. I think it's very dangerous when politicians try to moralize about how people live their lives. The way I think about it is we need to make it as easy as possible for people to do the right thing. And at a local level in St Albans District, Harpenden, Wheatamstead, Redbourne, the city of St Albans, that means that we need to turbocharge the cycling agenda. We need to be braver about using our urban space to make it easier for pedestrians and cyclists to get around. When it comes to our buses and public transport, we need to, again, electrify those and make them green so that those do not damage our climate change, our emissions. And what we also need to do is we need to plant a lot more trees and use our green spaces properly. It's something that I'm very committed to in my constituency. You will know of Hartwood Forest, which is obviously just outside St Albans, in my constituency, just outside the village of Sandridge. We need way more Hartwood forests, and we need smaller versions of Hartwood Forest, not just for the climate change impacts, but also because that improves the quality of people's lives and improves biodiversity, which, as we know, is under threat, even in our own country, let alone in parts of the Amazon or other parts of the world. So that's the sort of thing we need to be doing locally. In particular, I'm very excited about making cycling and pedestrian and the life of pedestrians easier in cities like St Albans and indeed in somewhere like Harpenden. And in particular, not just within the town or city, but to get between them. You know, I've been working very closely with people from Wheatamstead and in Harpenden to think, how do we design a system whereby it's easy to cycle from, say, Wheatamstead to Harpenden Station, then go to work? Because there's no point someone cycling from their home if they live in Harpenden. There's no point someone saying they want to cycle, but they're only cycling with their kids at weekends, and during the week they're driving to the station every time. So I do think that we really need to upgrade this. The government, again, has done some good things on this. Grant Shapps, who's my constituency neighbour in Welwyn Hatfield, has invested, I think it's £2 billion for cycling. We need more, and we need that money to be used more easily in local areas like my own, and indeed probably like St Albans as well. So that's how I see it, both at a national and local level, and I'm very happy to answer your questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you. That's a lot of food for thought, and thank you for packing that into just a short few minutes. Great to see we've got lots of questions coming up. While people continue to write those, perhaps I could start off with a sort of general one, is that a lot of things that you said there, people will kind of think sound pretty good. it seems to us, I think, if I can speak for everyone, which I'm sure I can't, that there's issues of speed and scale here, that there's lots of ambition and lots of fine words, but the Conservative Party are in power with a large majority, and consistently voting against, yourself included, in voting against measures that would support the climate emergency. If people want to look at, somewhere like theyworkforyou.com, it's got all the facts and figures there about what government ministers and members of parliament are actually doing, as opposed to saying that they're going to do. So how do you sound like you're trying to push your fellow MPs on your party to do more? What prospect is there for your party actually delivering at the sort of speed and scale that we need if we're going to solve this crisis?
That's a very good question. And frankly, when I look at my voting record on They Work For You, I barely recognise it. The nature of how a lot of that ends up being described is misleading for the following reason. And by the way, I will come on to the substance of what you say. I just want to address this particular point. It can be misleading because opposition parties, by the way, and it would be the same if we were in opposition, so I do not criticise them for this, put motions down, and governments, in the nature of parliamentary politics, defeat opposition motions because when you're in government, you control the House of Commons. That's what being in government is about. The way we do what we are trying to achieve, and of course, we can argue about whether that's good, bad, or ugly, is we do that through our actions in budgets or in legislation. And of course, we were pretty much the first major industrialized country to legislate for net zero to 2050. That came under a Conservative government. That was initiated not by any opposition. That was initiated by a Conservative government. So I hear you, and I do think we need to be accountable for what we do, but it's not entirely always fair, some of the ways how some of the votes are characterized. The substance, though, the fundamental point you're asking, though, is basically, can you trust us to go fast enough, right? You're being very polite, but you're basically saying, we don't really think you're going to move fast enough on this. We get that you sort of are doing a few things, but we don't really think you're going to move fast enough. I hear that criticism. What I would say to you is, it is not just in the interests of our environment, whether it be local, national, or global, but it's also in our political interest to move fast. And let me explain why. We all know what COVID-19 has done to jobs, particularly in certain parts of the country. Thankfully, and I don't want to speak for St Albans particularly because I know it less well than my own constituency, but things appear to be reasonably okay-ish in our constituency in terms of people's jobs at the moment. And things haven't been as bad as they have been in other parts of the country. But more broadly, this is a recession double the size of the financial crisis. And there is going to be a significant need, particularly in areas of the North and Midlands that have marginal seats that the Conservative Party managed to win for some of which were from the very first time in the election, where, as I mentioned in my talk, a lot of the workforce is in carbon-intensive industries. They remember the 80s and how they felt the Conservative Party abandoned them in deindustrialization. And the idea now that we would throw away a chance to make sure there are high quality, good green jobs going to those areas, I think would be mad politically. So I suppose what I'm trying to say is, even if you didn't necessarily believe that all members of the Conservative Party feel as strongly about this issue as I do, and many people do, and of course, there's a range of views in the party. And by the way, the Labour Party also has a range of views. Politically, it's been made very clear within the party that this is absolutely key, that we use getting to net zero as a very good way of generating economic growth and high quality jobs almost everywhere across the country. And so, that's why I am confident. And that's why I'm so confident talking very openly and very publicly about what we need to do, because I know that I'm pushing in the direction that we're already going in. What I'm trying to do is move us on a bit faster.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to go to Rebecca now for her question, which is a nice pointy one to start with and quite high level. So Rebecca, would you unmute and ask your question? Rebecca, are you able to unmute and ask your question? If not, perhaps I'll ask it on your behalf then. It's, will BIM back the climate and ecological emergency bill like Daisy Cooper has?
I will not, because what I know is that we are taking our own way of doing this. But what I am doing is I'm engaging very closely with Caroline Lucas, in particular, and others in my role as chair of the APPG on renewable and sustainable energy. We are and I haven't even mentioned COP26 yet, but we are the main parliamentary liaison vehicle for COP26. It will come through my APPG. And I'm working very closely with her and engaging with her on it. I don't think it actually does what we necessarily need to do. But what I do know is that it has been looked at the very highest levels. We are going to seek to, through government action in our budget, in the energy white paper that's due to come out in the coming weeks, address those issues and move forward in our own way.
Okay, thank you. And staying on that subject, I'm going to ask Chris Allen to ask your question, please, on a similar subject, if you can, Chris.
Yeah, okay. I was going to ask, you talked a lot about net zero, BIM, but I would like to hear your views on the UK funding and investing internationally in fossil fuel projects, and also offsetting its own carbon targets by basically allocating its own carbon emissions to other countries, thereby making it easier to achieve targets by kind of passing the buck, if you will.
So I'll take the first bit first. This has come up a lot, and the Prime Minister's been asked about it a lot. In relation to investing in things that are not net zero compliant, so to speak. It's a difficult one, and let me explain why. Alongside climate change, there's also the issue of some of the poorest areas in the world trying to make a living. We have a lot of commitments to our aid budget. Now, our aid budget, we are gradually divesting out of fossil fuel projects. And we've said that, I think Rory Stewart, when he was Secretary of State, started that. And I think that that's continued. And I'm not sure if we're 100% there yet, but that's the policy intention. But when you have a situation where you have certain investments that in a particular place at a particular time will alleviate poverty, it is not necessarily a 100% decision. That becomes quite a difficult decision. So I'm not saying it's always done, we've always made the right one, but I just want to recognize that there is a balance to be struck with that. The second point you make, however, around when you've got effectively, I'm going to paraphrase, and correct me if I get this wrong. What you're basically saying is, if we achieve targets by getting more products from somewhere else where they don't have the same sort of restrictions, we look cleaner, but in aggregate, the globe hasn't got any better or safer, right? That's basically what you're saying. I think that's a real danger. I don't think it really benefits anybody. It doesn't benefit domestic British business because they're losing business to a cheaper, it's the equivalent of sort of on agriculture, right? Like if you get your food from a country which has very low standards and it's cheaper, well, who benefits from that particularly? So I think it's a real danger. I think it's something we need to look at. I don't know. I need to investigate further the extent to which anybody is actively, deliberately doing this, or whether it is a byproduct of the fact that in this country we've got pretty high standards. And there are unscrupulous people who will say, okay, you've got high standards, I'll do this somewhere else. And unless we want to be in the position, and I talk about poverty alleviation again, my father's Nigerian, my mum's half English, half Nigerian, okay? So country like Nigeria, pretty poor country, has a reasonable amount of trade with Britain. I am willing to wager that the majority of what Nigeria sells to Britain is not done at the same environmental standards to the extent that that's relevant as what we have here. Are we willing to say we're not doing any trade with Nigeria? I'm not sure we are willing to say that. What I think we should be saying is, here is a way of doing that thing to our standard. We're going to give you a cut price technology that's been developed in Britain. And by doing that, we are alleviating poverty, but doing it in a green way. And at COP26, that's the sort of thing that I think the Western world needs to start to commit to. The money needs to go into helping developing countries develop, but do so in a green way. And that way, countries like Britain or France or America or wherever can economically also benefit from the fact that things are getting better. So for me, that's a sort of win-win scenario. What I don't think is feasible is for you to say, look, we're not going to help you because that isn't done to our high green standards, because that does result in poverty. And ultimately, why do we care about the environment? We care about it because of human beings and the impact that will have eventually on human beings if we don't sort it out.
Thank you. Can I just invite, and thanks, Chris, for your question. In question time style, I'm looking out into the audience and I saw Nicky Clark, you had a big reaction there. I don't know if you wanted to make a comment on what you just heard, or just to give you the opportunity to do that if you'd like to.
Thank you. I'm just frustrated that everything comes back to money, about making profit. You know, there's so much money tied up at the top, and I'm not prepared to sort of go into detail. I'm just frustrated by the fact that the thought of encouraging developing, which is a debatable, I'm not sure if we could class ourselves as developed anymore, developing countries to get to where we are by doing it greenly. At the same time, we make a profit out of that. I don't like that at all. We don't need to make a profit out of helping developing countries.
Okay, thanks for your comment, Nicky, and sorry for putting you on the spot there. I'm going to move on to the next question, if you forgive me, because I want to get through as many as we can. Quite a few people asked about housing. So Cheryl Norgan, can I come to you to ask your question? It touches on an issue that quite a few people have mentioned. Go ahead, Cheryl.
Yeah, my question was, if the government's target is 300,000 houses to be built nationally, that's been worked out as 24 million tonnes of greenhouse gases that's being created. And my question to Bim is, how by doing that, is that helping climate change?
Good question. The answer is people have to live somewhere. The question is, how do you build that housing in as a sustainable way as possible from an energy perspective? What that looks like to me is it means that we should be doing a lot less of sort of tacking on 100 or 200 houses on the edge of every village. But what we should be doing is building as many as we can new, sustainable, green communities with high quality housing that we've talked about, but also with jobs locally that people can cycle or walk to, or if they need to, take public transport to. Because if you can do that, then over time, actually, those houses and those communities become environmentally sustainable. I don't think you can just take the view, which is, well, the act of building anything will generate carbon emissions, which of course it does. Therefore, we won't build anything, because that just isn't the sustainable outcome. And people will never, ever agree to that.
Thanks. Philip Nalpanis, you asked similar questions. Did you want to follow up on anything that Bim said or introduce a new angle to that?
Thank you, yes. My question sort of related to that is, okay, we're going to build 300,000 new houses. Why on earth is there not going to be, as I understand it, a legal requirement that they are all built to passive house standard? Will you push for such a standard?
Yes, so this is a misapprehension. I've looked at this, and Philip, it's good to see you.
Thank you.
I've looked at this. In our planning white paper, which is not legislation yet, but the legislation will be brought forward in the coming months. The new houses will be built to a standard from which they will not have to be retrofitted to hit net zero. That is going to be the standard. And as far as I'm concerned, that's good enough for me. So that is the standard that the houses that we'll be building. I think the harder question is how you deal with existing houses.
Yes.
You know, I live in a grade 2 listed house, right? That's actually reasonably warm, bizarrely enough. But you know, how do you deal with very old houses? Because insulating those and retrofitting those is a very expensive business. And I don't think the government's going to be able to afford to pay everybody to do that to their homes. So you've got a real decision to make on how fast or how intensively you force people to become more energy efficient. My view would be you get to a point whereby after a particular date, you say in order to sell a house, you need to have met a certain minimum standard of energy efficiency. And by doing that, you'd force people to effectively upgrade their own homes.
Interesting answer.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks for that, and thanks, Philip. Jack Easton, I'm going to come to you. You got an interesting question early on about lifestyles of the, I'm going to say rich and famous, but you know what I mean. Do you want to ask your question, Jack?
Sure. And I guess it does, in some ways, end up with rich and famous. Bim, hi, and thank you for joining us this evening. You may have seen, and if you haven't, I'm sure you'll find afterwards, a report from Oxfam in September, which analysed carbon emissions by wealth brackets. And you can see their percentages, but basically it's the people with shed loads of money, vast houses, etc., that emit all the carbon by pursuing their wealthy lifestyles. Therefore, if we're going to have any serious short-run impact on carbon emissions, the wealthy have to start turning their private jets into ploughshares, heating just 2 bedrooms of their 10-bedroom houses, not taking 6 holidays, etc., etc., etc. In other words, the biggest short-term impact we can have is for the rich and famous, as Simon rightly calls them, to really seriously change their lifestyle. These are people that can pay any tax at all that you wanted to add to a cost of a flight. What are we going to do about the rich and famous?
Very good question. I've thought about this before because I've often thought about a way, I've kicked around a policy idea of, say, increasing air passenger duty, for example. Now, if you did that, yes, it would make it more expensive for rich people to fly, but they can afford to pay that, no problem. They'll barely notice it. The people who really lose out are people who take one holiday every 2-3 years, and that brings that holiday sort of above a price point where they can go. So for me, this goes back to what I was saying at the beginning about taxing bad things and making it easier for people to do good things. And making it easier, one of the ways in which you do that is obviously lowering taxes on other things. So for me, this is the debate around a carbon tax and how that would come into force. I'm very comfortable with the idea of saying, if you are doing certain things that are carbon intensive, you should pay more for the more of those things that you do. For example, road pricing, right? We pay road tax at the moment. Everybody pays road tax that's basically the same unless it's an electric vehicle where I think you pay 0 road tax, so it's much reduced. I don't really think that's fair because what you end up with is some people drive thousands of miles, some people drive barely at all. I think that road pricing should reflect the amount of miles that somebody drives. And by doing that, effectively, somebody is paying more for the polluting that they are doing. So that is the principle, I think, that's a fair one. It would also incentivize people to have healthier lifestyles, more sustainable lifestyles. And if they choose to behave in the same way, which is their choice, and I believe in personal freedom, if they choose to do that, then effectively they are helping us and helping the government and helping society invest in the green things that we all discuss that we need to do. So there's a balance between a change of behavior and raising revenue. I think that's completely fair enough. I don't think, however, that you should sort of ban people from doing things. I think they should just have to pay for what they do.
But that's the whole point. If they can just, these are not equally tradable things. To pay extra in order to continue to destroy the habitat of the rest of the population is quite a license. And you said yourself on the way through that basically no answer to the question. We will simply have the rich and the famous emitting carbon until they're the only ones left. That's the trajectory that we face unless we constrain activity.
Okay, so this is where I do depart a little bit from your analysis. I think that's over the top. And I think that it would be a great constraint on human freedom. What you need to do is you need to incentivize people to do things in a much less carbon intensive way. You incentivize them from doing that at a personal level. You incentivize companies in the private sector from investing in things that therefore mean they can do what they want to do in a green or greener way. That's why we should try and come up with electric planes. That's why we should move forward the date of electric cars. That's why we should electrify our industrial processes. That's why we should have more renewable energy. Why? Because it means if you have more renewable energy, you can keep the lights on in your house. And you can do that without guilt or fear or favor, because you know that actually your energy is being produced, more and more of it is being produced in a renewable way. I don't think the answer to that question is to say, you have to live in darkness. I think the answer to that question is, we need more renewable energy. Do you see what I mean? I'm not saying your point is illegitimate. I'm just saying
you're cheating.
I lend on the other side.
The difference between an ordinary person having a bit of daylight in the evenings or somebody in Africa having a little bit of local solar, giving them a light bulb to extend the day, is not the same as a wealthy person having enough energy to heat a vast house, to travel thousands and thousands of miles personally. I better stop. You can have the last word if you wish, because there are other questions.
We'll move on to other questions.
Thank you. I mean, the whole issue of, is it legitimate to restrict people's personal freedom in order to fight the climate emergency is a huge and perhaps the number one issue that I think certainly I as a Green feel that other parties are simply not facing up to. People drive faster than 70 miles an hour on the motorway because they've got a fast car. They ideally go to prison because it's dangerous to everybody else. Anyway, we could talk about that all night. But let's move on to another area of government policy. Sophie Barber, you've got an interesting question about trees. Would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Hi, Bim. Well, it's. I commend the fact that you obviously want to plant lots of trees. But my real issue, as you know, because we've been in correspondence, is how do you justify the devastation and the trashing of trees and woodlands and habitats because of HS2? And I'm seriously really interested as to how you and your government can really justify this train line that is not needed anymore. And I'm really worried about it.
I'll give you a short answer. I think with increasing difficulty. So, I think that, look, I'm a pro-infrastructure sort of person. I'm a pro-public transport person. I like trains. I want people to get around. I think that's important. In the aftermath of COVID, or as we come out of COVID, it seems harder and harder to justify this project. And I suspect quite strongly that people will be having this debate in the coming months, because I think it is tricky. However, the broader point of whether it's okay to do any infrastructure or not, or whether we should effectively live with what we have, I don't accept. I think I accept your criticisms about HS2, and I hear you on that. But the broader issue, a bit like the question on housing, we can't just, we still need to do things. We still need to get around. We still need to live in this country. We need to live on this planet. And we do need to be able to build infrastructure. The question is, what do you build and how and where? And that's one of the reasons why I'm in favor of road building. Why? Because we're trying to move to electric cars. Where are all these electric cars going to go unless they've got the right roads for them? So that doesn't mean you're in favor of every road. I just make the broader point that building infrastructure is not necessarily bad in a green perspective. Forget every other consideration, even in a green consideration. But I hear your point on HS2.
Okay, did you want to come back on that, Sophie? I know it's a long long-standing issue for you, Lily.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's huge. But I mean, just one other little thing that I noticed, that you were saying that we ought to be taxing the carbon-intensive industries, and of course, HS2 is just that: concrete, cement, and also destroying so many carbon sequestering landscapes. It's just criminal to even consider HS2.
Okay, I want to thank you very much for that. Thank you for your question. Davina, I'd like to come to you. So you have a question about something that is Green Party policy. So it'd be interesting to hear Bim's reaction to your question if you want to.
Sorry, I had two questions.
I'm looking at the one on Citizens Assembly, but you take your pick if you'd rather ask a different one.
Yes. You say how difficult it is to raise taxes and balance them out. One of the options is to have a Citizens Assembly which Parliament actually listens to, because we've had one before, but there are lots of good ideas, but they hadn't got power to make it happen. But if you had a Citizens Assembly who could actually work out which is fair, who do they want to tax, what do they want to tax, where do they want the roads built, do they want more roads, all those sort of questions that ordinary people could have a say about, and that Parliament would then listen to, I think would be a good idea. Do you?
The problem with Citizens Assembly, and thank you, it's a good question, and I've thought about it a lot. The problem with Citizens Assembly that has power is that starts to look a bit like Parliament, right? So if it has no power, then it's a talking shop, and I'm not convinced it necessarily is useful. If it has power, a group of citizens talking about issues that decide what to do, that's what Parliament's meant to be. Now, if Parliament isn't doing that job, then that's an issue with Parliament, and then we need to reform how that works. I'm quite relaxed about, so, we have all these select committees, we get evidence from members of the public. My experience sitting on select committees is that you tend to get evidence from the same members of the public. They tend to be very particular sorts of people who get called for evidence. Like, by the way, it doesn't make those people wrong or illegitimate or bad. It just means that you're not necessarily getting a fuller view. I would like to see select committees tour the country more. I like to see them do versions of question time to talk about different issues. There's no reason why the energy select committee, or rather the business, energy and industrial strategy select committee couldn't be doing versions of what you're describing, but through the structures that we have. And the reason why I think the structures are important is not just because I'm a crusty conservative who likes institutions, though that I am. It's that you need to be able to have a formal accountability behind the decisions that are made. Because ultimately, unless members of Parliament and the government isn't going to be accountable, then nothing is really going to happen. And if it did, it wouldn't be legitimate. So the way we make decisions is through elections, and then Parliament makes decisions. If you decide to subvert that process, then you run the risk of bad things happening and Parliament turning around and just saying, we're going to cancel all of that because we don't agree. So that's the difficulty with them.
Okay, thank you for that question, Davina. And I mean, I think I would encourage everyone, including Bim, to go and read up how citizens' assemblies really work and how that accountability situation between elected parliamentarians and the Citizens' Assembly, the whole point of which is that they're not the usual suspects, they are randomly chosen, how that works. And it's worked brilliantly in places like Oxford. Again, that's something we could have a whole meeting about. Interesting, I know it's something St Albans District Council is looking at setting up next year, which is great news as far as I'm concerned. I want to come to Matthew Maddock. You've asked a few questions about environmental impact assessments. Can you sum that up into one neat question?
Yeah, okay. Thank you for coming this evening, Bim, and thank you for admitting that you don't vote on things based on their merit, but instead about party lines. I'm basically wanted to ask about your vote 6 weeks ago against environmental impact assessments on money that would be given out to groups under the United Kingdom Internal Market Bill. You were talking just now about how important it is to know that money is being spent on the right things. How can you do that if you're not forcing public money to be scrutinized before you're giving it away to corporations?
Money spent by any government department is subject to a huge number of checks. In the pandemic, a lot of decisions were made very quickly because of the speed of it, and some things went awry, and I think everybody knows that. But the broader point is that there are huge numbers of checks when decisions are made and money is spent. And after the money has been spent, the National Audit Office crawls all over it with a fine tooth comb. And having sat on the Public Accounts Committee, I can tell you these are some of the smartest, most dedicated public servants you're ever likely to meet. And the quality and detail with which they go into decisions is huge. So imposing environment, I mean, honestly, I can barely remember a piece of legislation here where people haven't tried to tag on an amendment, an environmental impact assessment. Putting an environmental impact assessment on something doesn't necessarily change any decision at all. What it does is it makes the decision slower, and it ultimately doesn't necessarily change whether that decision is going to happen or not. So it is not a panacea, and it doesn't really achieve the aim that people purport that it does. What it does do is it gives opposition parties something to do, and to suggest that, oh, well, you should just do an environmental impact assessment, or you can do an equalities assessment, or you should do an assessment for this or an assessment for that. What it does is it jumps up and bureaucratizes government even more than it already is. And I don't think that's necessarily a wise way to go.
So you don't think it's like useful for people like the public to be able to have those things specifically like taken away from other considerations and put in its own like environmental assessment when coming to deal with, like, you talk about infrastructure. Should infrastructure not have its own specific environmental assessment that is then available to the public in such a way that it is, taken away from all other kinds of spending and taken away from like it can just be seen very clearly as its own individual issue?
I can tell you, doing even 20-mile-an-hour speed limits in one of my villages requires an assessment as to whether any natural habitat is damaged by the placing of the poles. And that is a true thing. The reason why I say that is that building anything in this country is already subject to significant environmental checks. Anybody on this meeting, on this call, will know that if they've ever tried to, if they've lived in a rural area and they've tried to do anything with their house, or they've tried to do something in the garden, the assessments they have to make on badgers or bats or various other environmental decisions. Environmental decisions are actually at the heart of our law and at the heart of when we make any sort of infrastructural decision. So I don't think in infrastructure that really is a problem.
I mean, as someone who's worked in regeneration and house building, I just disagree with you because I have seen what developers do to get around those things, including lying about when bats or badgers are there, and to like trivialize it to bats and badgers seems a bit, disingenuous to me, but I understand.
I wasn't, no, hold on. I wasn't trivializing it.
So, yeah.
What I'm saying is, if your issue is developers getting around the rules, then let's tackle people getting around the rules. Creating another rule doesn't mean people won't get around the rules. So if the issue is developers can be very sharp. I've seen it in my constituency and I've seen it across the country. You're right, developers can do things that are wrong, as lots of other people can too. Then we need to tackle enforcement. By all means, yes, let's tackle enforcement, but don't just say the rules don't exist when they do.
Okay, thank you very much for that that exchange. It is now 8:45, so I'm going to let you go, Ben. Thank you so much for
Thank you. I really, really appreciate you guys all listening to me and being so kind and friendly.
Perhaps
So
we
I
can
really
do it again.
appreciate.
Perhaps we can do it again sometime next year.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bim.
So